Hello, welcome to the Institute of World Politics. As a courtesy to our speaker, please ensure that all devices are silent. For those of you who are new to IWP, we are a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degrees, including 2 online, and 18 certificates of graduate study. If you are interested in learning more about us, please feel free to speak out to one of our staff at the conclusion of this event, or visit iwp.edu. To support the work of IWP, please visit iwp.edu/donate. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Enrico Suardi, who will discuss the behavioral sciences in U.S. national security. Dr. Suardi was in the IWP class of 2019, Executive Masters in National Security Affairs, and is Director of Psychiatry at St. Elizabeth Hospital and Director of Forensic Services at the Ross Center in Washington, D.C. A diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and Psychiatry, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and Forensic Psychiatry on faculty at St. Elizabeth Hospital, Georgetown University, and George Washington University. He has practiced psychiatry for over 15 years in public and private settings, including serving as Chief Child and Family Psychiatrist at the U.S. State Department. Currently, he is the Secretary of the Washington Psychiatric Society and the treasurer of the DC Mid-Atlantic chapter of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. Dr. Suardi studied medicine and public health in Milan, Italy, and obtained an MSc in public health and policy from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. His interest in political and operational psychology stems from a long-standing passion for international affairs and diplomacy. So please welcome Dr. Suardi.
Thank you, Joshua, for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me. And it's great to be back here at IWP. I'm grateful for this. And the goal today is to present a historical overview of the involvement of the behavioral sciences in U.S. national security. I like to take a historical approach because I like to think of myself as a student of history. As such, I think of history as a session for all time and a life's teacher, as are classical. The Institute here does utilize the power of our classical heritage of the arts of statecraft. Statecraft requires a fine understanding of what happens in the world, and the environment, identify linkages, find challenges and opportunities, then make policy and implement it. I borrowed some of these words from an article that is published in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. The title is The Return of Statecraft, and the author is Professor Cohen. The IWP founder, who just walked in, good evening, has advocated for the integration of of national power, including all the spectrum of diplomatic engagement. And this approach to statecraft is pragmatic and strategic. It balances interests and values. U.S. the Constitution assigns to the government the responsibility for the common defense and general welfare of the nation. National security depends on the response to threats that come from nation states, but also from non-state actors in wartime as well as in peacetime. So it's on a continuum that requires coordinated efforts by the military and civilian branches of government at different levels of government, federal, state, and local, in partnership with a variety of other actors, including private sector. And the overall goal is to ensure the domestic tranquility of the nation. And using the expression of St. Augustine in the City of God, the tranquility of order. Tranquility of order in a liberal democracy is rooted in the rule of law, in justice, in pluralism and tolerance, consent rather than coercion. So all these history, strategy, statecraft, national security, and that's really my point today, is the work and the product of people, individuals, small and large groups, societies, nations. So therefore, the human factor matters here. In other words, how people think, how they feel, how they identify themselves, how they interact with each other, what motivates them, what humiliates them, what makes them tick. And so there is a need for, and that's my point, for the disciplines that investigate scientific human behavior to have a seat at the table of national security and statecraft. And today I'm going to highlight historically some of the contributions of some of these disciplines. Psychology, which is the scientific study of the human mind and its function. Anthropology, that studies human societies and cultures. And psychiatry, that is a branch of medicine, diagnoses and treats mental illness, but it's also broader than that, in my view. And, just as a caveat, I'm not a psychologist or an anthropologist. I'm just a psychiatrist who has an interest in international affairs. So I'm going to start the historical journey with you. And I want to go back to very early on, to Revolutionary War time, even though at that time there was really no scientific study of human mind and human behavior. And adverse reactions to combat situations were seen essentially as signs of defective character. Yet, from a different standpoint, psychological operations were nothing new and were ongoing. And here you have an example of a leaflet produced by the colonials who were encouraging the enemy troops to desert, by telling them how better off they would be switching sides. And of course, the British troops were running their own retaliatory propaganda, depicting the colonials as mobs of renegades, essentially. Now let's fast forward to the Civil War time, a time when military medicine was in its infancy. And this is when the concept of nostalgia or soldier's art were first introduced in as clinical terms to describe combat-related stress. These are the precursors of what we call now post-traumatic stress disorder. And at this time, it became clear that there were large numbers of psychological victims of combat, and also that substance abuse and withdrawal from substances like substances like alcohol, morphine, cocaine were significant problems. And this was also the time of the institutionalization of mental health care in the United States. Asylums were established as part of what was known as moral treatment of the mentally ill. And the US government hospital for the insane, that was also known as St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and still is known as St. Elizabeth's Hospital, was founded in 1855. And it started admitting right away during the war many military servicemen. It was functioning also as a general hospital, not just as a psychiatric hospital at that point. Those were the needs. It received the visit of President Lincoln in 1862. And I have here a photo of the original building of the hospital. That wasn't even complete at the time when the Civil War was happening. I salute the institution where I serve right now as director of psychiatry, as was said. Now, this building is now part of the headquarters of Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security, that's taken over in recent times whole side of the hospital. And the current St. Elizabeth's Hospital doesn't look like that, and it is on a different side. All right, so I'm gonna fast forward again here, and we are at the turn of the century, end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century. And at this point, the US military has begun to step more decisively into the international stage. End of the century, there was the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and the intervention in the Boxer Rebellion in China. And so there is an awareness of this young nation, of its emerging greatness, and there is the responsibility that comes from that. And I thought that this was well represented by these words of President Theodore Roosevelt in his inaugural speech in 1905. And so, just a decade later, we have World War I, the Great War. And this is really, the World War I is really what marks the official beginning of the involvement of the behavioral sciences in US national security. The US enters the war in 1917, and a massive effort to expand the armed forces is needed. And so great change, big changes, massive efforts in that sense. Also, the nature of the war, of warfare in the Great War is such that new challenges exist in managing adjustment, stress reactions, but also healthcare logistics, decision-making processes. And psychology at that time is a very young science. You know, psychology separates from philosophy in the second half of the 19th century, becomes a scientific discipline, really in the last quarter of the century. And Dr. Robert Yerkes was a psychologist at Yale, relatively young. He was elected president of the American Psychological Association at that time. And he became a champion for the involvement of psychology in the war effort. And so what psychologists, American psychologists did was they put together their emerging methods to meet the needs of the military in testing for intelligence and aptitude. And by the end of the war, over 1.5 million of inductees were actually assessed, primarily with two tests, the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. The Army Alpha was for the literates, the Army Beta was for the literates or non-English speaking. Also, a personality test, the first personality test was developed at that time, but it wasn't even ready in its final form. It was published, in its final form right after. And it was based on case studies and interviews done during the war. Also, sanitary corps psychologists started conducting studies on morale, training, desertion, and also propaganda. An important name was the name of Dr. Edwin Boring, who also out of Yale, coordinated the preparation of a report that was published after the war, 1921, summarizing the results of the work done by the psychologists during the war. And it's important to point out that all this intelligence, attitude, personality testing, this was the precursor of subsequent psychological assessments that have been developed in the following decades and are still in use. The idea of testing people in groups was also new and was adopted in the private sector and in academic centers, in university, of course for different purposes and in different ways, but group testing. Also, World War I marked the beginning of neurosurgery and neurocognitive rehabilitation in response to head trauma. Dr. Hardy Cushing, who is considered the father of modern neurological surgery, was a surgeon in the army in France in 1917 and 1918. And he operated on over 100 soldiers with brain wounds. That's really the beginning, the birth of modern neurosurgery. And a leading pioneer in neurorehabilitation was the head of psychology at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and his name was Dr. Franz. Second time I mentioned St. Elizabeth's Hospital here. Aviation psychology was born, and because it was so important, was recognized it was so important to select and train the right people to become pilots, also because of how expensive the equipment is, right? You need the right people there. The principles of forward mental health and early intervention in combat stress were established during World War I. The principles of proximity, immediacy, and expediency of the intervention. And cognitive restructuring techniques were developed for these interventions in situations that were described at that time as shell shock or gas hysteria for the victims of chemical warfare. Now, this work is important because provided some of the foundations for the development of the cognitive theory that came much later in the 1950s by Aaron Beck with the clinical applications, cognitive behavioral therapy that is a well-known therapeutic intervention very much in use these days. So the war ends and we have the interwar period between the two world wars. What we see in the interwar period is that certain line of development of this work continue. For example, psychological assessment and selection. And there is also a contribution here that comes from Germany, from the German Defense Forces, the Wehrmacht, that developed in those years a new approach to assess and select officers. They had assessment centers, and over a period of a few days, candidates were assessed with tests and exercises. They had multidisciplinary boards that included military officers, physicians, and psychologists. Now, the British military observed what the Germans were doing and took a page from them and combined that with the psychometric approach that came from the US. And they created a new model called the British War Selection Boards, and that would later be actually adopted in the US by the Office of Strategic Services for this purpose, and as I will say. And in this picture here, there are some of the clinicians that were involved in this work in the UK, and these were from the reputable Tavistock Clinic in London. Now, another interesting line of development here in the interwar period, really starting from the war, came from the recognition of public opinion as a major force. That was another legacy of the Great War. So war was not just about the line of fire and the line of supply of the line of fire. It was very much about ideas. And the war of ideas has to be fought in the hearts and minds of people. And this is why, the President Woodrow Wilson established a Committee on Public Information to plead the justice of the American cause and fight for the verdict of humanity. George Creel, who was a journalist and oversaw the activities of the committee, published a book right after the war about that. And there were a number of interesting people involved in the work of this Committee on Public Information. One of them was Edward Bernays, who was originally from Vienna, and he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He actually organized the publication of Freud's introductory lecture on psychoanalysis when Freud came in the 1910s and introduced psychoanalysis in the US. But Bernays has become known as the father of public relations, PR, and a pioneer in advertising. And basically what he did is apply some of the principles of propaganda to marketing. 1928, that book, Propaganda, that is there. Now, the challenges that we have in comprehending our socio-political environment is the topic of public opinion by Walter Lippmann, published in 1922. And Lippmann was building on a literature that went back to the end of the 19th century. Gustave Le Bon, The Crowd, the study of the popular mind. And Lippmann highlights the irrational nature of social perceptions that can influence behavior and hinder social cohesion. And he thought that the problem was not so much the access to information, but really the ability to process information, the fact that human cognition is flawed. And he envisioned a class of experts, social behavioral scientists, who would operate beyond voters and politicians and really interpret reality and set the policy-making agenda for all of us. Instead, a critical review of the role of government in molding public opinion came from Harold Laswell, who's one of the founders of American political psychology. And that book on the right, Propaganda Technique in World War I, comes from his doctorate dissertation, where he introduced content analysis, a scientific method to analyze communication. And he continued to refine that and would later analyze Nazi propaganda in World War II as chief of the Division of Wartime Communication at the Library of Congress. So that's an important line of development in interwar period. Now, third line of development that I selected here is really the beginning of industrial psychology and the psychology of management, which originates from another doctorate dissertation from the work of Lillian Gilbreth in the 1910s. And Gilbreth was a pioneer in understanding the human factor in management. The fact that employees, workers are not just economic units, they have to be seen as whole persons, right? And therefore, attention has to be given to communication within organizations and human relations. That's where human HR comes from. Now, along this line, in the 1930s, an immigrant from social scientists who immigrated from Germany to the US to escape Nazi, and Kurt Lewin, developed the concept of action research, research that is aimed at solving problems in ongoing processes. And Kurt Lewin focused on group dynamics and he studied social and organizational behavior. And this led to applications in the field of training, organizational change, leadership development, group performance, influence on population behavior. And this work has been very important, become a cornerstone for psychologists to do consultative work in the national security organization, but also in the private sector. So we're moving towards World War II here, and as Americans' involvement in World War II became imminent, we find again the name of Dr. Yerkes, who is now in his 60s and is utilizing his influence and understanding of how the government works to position psychology to establish an even broader platform for the involvement of psychology in the war. And Edwin Boring, also mentioned before, takes a leading role here. And by the end of the war, we will have edited these two books about the contributions of American psychologists to the war in a variety of areas, assessment, selection, training, but also adjustment, improving resilience, morale, leadership, propaganda and psychological warfare. Everything in World War II is on a bigger scale and even more consequential in terms of the involvement of the behavioral sciences. For example, the field of aviation psychology is expanded and will continue after the war in the civilian airline industry. The field of head injury rehabilitation also grows and will become a subdiscipline, neuropsychology, after the war. Research is conducted and published for the first time on malingering, the exaggeration or fake of illness, and self-mutilation for the purpose of escaping contact and service. Also, program instructional methods of teaching are developed for the first time in consultation with psychologists, including Dr. Skinner, who is considered the father of behaviorism. And these methods are based on the understanding that learning can be accomplished better in small increments when learners get immediate feedback. A whole chapter that's quite interesting is the involvement of behavioral sciences in the work of the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS is actually considered the birthplace of the field of operational psychology. Operational psychology is psychology in the service of national security and law enforcement. OSS was founded by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt by executive order. The purpose was to, as you all know, to integrate strategic intelligence, but also to carry out clandestine and unconventional warfare behind enemy lines. And we need people who are capable of doing that. Not everybody can, right? So how do you select them? And the model came from the British War Office selection boards. And Henry Murray, who is a big name in this field, and is better known as one of the developers of the thematic perception test, TAT, which is a projective test that's still in use. He was the chief psychologist of OSS, and he edited a book on the assessment and selection of personnel for the OSS. They had this all-person concept and looked at a number of dimensions. Now, William Donovan, the founding director of OSS, was a trailblazer. From his creative mind also came the idea to have a psychological profile of Adolf Hitler. And it was compiled, the task was given to a team led by Harvard psychologist, psychoanalyst William Langer. And the interesting thing is that they predicted that he would die by suicide if he was losing the war. Now, Erik Erikson is another psychoanalyst, another immigrant from Germany who escaped the Nazi in the 1930s. And he pulled together his psychoanalytic background and his interest in anthropology to offer to the OSS a enlightened view of Hitler's appeal on the Germans, particularly the young Germans.
And he would later publish this analysis in what is considered his masterpiece, Childhood and Society, in which he includes also the model of the 8 ages of man, the 8 stages of psychological development. And this work by Langer and Erickson really it marks the beginning of the field of indirect assessment of foreign leaders, which is ongoing. And we'll talk a little more about that. Well, social psychological research, as I said, was already happening before World War II, but it was greatly expanded during the war. Studies were conducted on propaganda and persuasion, morale, leadership, cooperation and conflict, negotiation, compliance. And from the line of work of Kurt Lewin, I mentioned, Carl Ogland, also out of Yale, joined the research branch of the Information and Education Division of the War Department. He studied persuasion and mass communication, and is the author of one of the 4 volumes on social psychology in World War II that were published after the war. Now, this was not just an academic, endeavor. These understandings, these social psychological understandings, were applied to propaganda and psychological work during and after the war. Another unique contribution of a psychologist came from Dr. Gustav Gilbert, who was fluent in Germany, and that's also probably why he was sent to act as a prison psychologist during the Nuremberg trials. And he tested psychologically with the Rorschach-Inkvok test the defendants, the 22 defendants. And after the war, he summarized his experience in a book in which he reflected on the psychology of dictatorship. American anthropologists also were using their professional knowledge to inform military and intelligence work during World War II. For example, in the Asia-Pacific theater of operation, helping design and implement the OSS campaigns, also studying Japanese social structure to prepare for post-war maintenance of order, and also helping to create foreign language programs. And all of the above, started to create some ethical controversies, which I will talk more about, and that continue. And speaking of, ethical concern, I thought I would also mention the work of Marvin Opler, Dr. Marvin Opler and others, on the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and the work done by the War Relocation Authority that is, summarized in the book Impounded People, published after the war. And this was a critical work by Marvin Opler about this sort of chapter of history. Now, so far, what we've seen that there are multiple lines of development in regard of the involvement of the behavioral sciences in national security. It's not linear, there are ebbs and flows. A lot gets done during the Great War, then there is development in the different direction, then there is another explosion, so to speak, of activity during World War II. And there is all these knowledge bases that these people can use. Now, after World War II, no time to rest and decommission, because immediately the Cold War starts, and it's perceived as, the threat of the Soviet Union is perceived as existential, is ideological, and the U.S. responds with the strategy of containment and the Truman Doctrine. I thought this words of President Truman could be, used to signify that. So basically, this nation that was young at the time of Theodore Roosevelt and that was realizing its emerging greatness and responsibility, now has decided to be the champion of the free world. So you see the evolution and the importance of that. And 1947 is a very important year in the history of national security, because it's the year of the National Security Act. So major restructuring and national security apparatus. National Security Council was established, CIA was born, and the war fight eventually the war fighting services were merged into the Department of Defense. Right. So at this time, the national security world looks with a lot of interest at the behavioral sciences, because there is a keen interest in understanding influence on human behavior. One of the first, I want to point out that one of the first memoranda out of the National Security Council, number 4, was devoted to psychological operations. And in 1951, President Truman established a psychological strategy board to streamline Americans' psychological operations. So the expectation was that the behavioral sciences were reaching a mature stage in their evolution, and they would have predictive capacity, predicting human behavior. And they were expected, therefore, to contribute to post-war reconstruction and to avert another global military conflict. But and then we have the Korean War, and the Korean War has an abrupt onset that really doesn't allow time to apply the principles, to apply well the principles of forward mental health intervention. Many psychological casualties during this war, and arguably one of the important issues emerging from the Korean War, at least for behavioral scientists to reckon with, was the effect of torture and brainwashing. Brainwashing was a new term coined at that time by a journalist to capture the impact of the intense ideological re-education that American prisoners of war were subjected to by the Chinese captors in conditions of great deprivation. SEER, special evasion, resistance, and escape training, was the brainchild of the suffering of these prisoners of war in Korea. It was developed by a working group established by President Eisenhower. And the goal here was to train service members to cope with the stress of captivity. Psychologists have been very involved in running these programs ever since. And speaking of brainwashing, another very interesting thing that happens around this time is the show trial of a Hungarian cardinal named, I will try to pronounce, Joseph Minzesti. He had been a staunch opponent of fascism and then became a staunch opponent of communism. And he was put to trial for treason, and he confessed things that he obviously had not done. The way he looked, the way he spoke, the things that he said, suggested strongly that he had been brainwashed, so to speak, and that the Soviet Union had found a way to maybe use chemicals to control people's mind and force confessions. So as a result of that, CIA was tasked with finding a line of defense and ended up setting up its own program of that went through iterations and eventually was known as MK Ultra. The purpose was to precisely attain human behavior control through various means, particularly psychoactive substances, particularly LSD. And actually these efforts were not productive, turned out to be counterproductive, and to generate backlash that lasts to these days. But instead, one other much more sensible line of effort developed by the CIA was the continuation, essentially, of the psychopolitical profiling started by the OSS with the biography of Adolf Hitler. And I want to mention here Gerald Post, who's recently passed away. He's been a kind mentor to many, including myself, and he, for 20 years, led the CIA Center for the Analysis of Personality and Behavior. And perhaps the highest point in his career was the contribution that his team gave to the preparation of the profiles of Prime Minister Begin of Israel and President Sadat of Egypt for the negotiators that were the broker the Camp David peace accords. And for all his work, Dr. Post was awarded the Intelligence Medal of Honor. Then he retired from the CIA and became a prolific author, many books, and an influential scholar. Now, behavioral health contributions during the Cold War also focused on the domestic front. When racial and social inequities within the US came front and center. And I want to mention here Gordon Allport's book on the nature of prejudice. He offered a compilation of research on individual and group prejudice while when the nation embarked in a process of soul-searching and change with the civil rights movement. And if one looks at the Constitution says, in order to form a more perfect union and confirm the self-evident truth that all people are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. And so this is also domestic tranquility and national security, because if one doesn't do what they say, people take notice. Meanwhile, overseas psychologists and anthropologists remained involved in counterinsurgency work. An example of that was a project, large-scale project called Camelot, that studied influence factors in social systems experiencing internal conflict and destabilizing influences. This work was not without controversy. Its purpose and ethical tenets were questioned. Some examples of questions: is the intentional and covert shaping of public opinion inherently repressive? Should behavioral sciences benefit US national security or mankind in general? And is it ethical to advance science while pursuing national interest? So, pretty tough questions. Now, out of the Cold War and the domino theory came the Vietnam War, another important war, and a time of division within the nation, which ended up amplifying the efficacy of the propaganda of the North Vietnamese and likely contributed to high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans who came back to a nation where, a lot of people didn't like what they had been involved with. The prevalence of character pathology and substance abuse was very high during the Vietnam War, and there were organizational decisions that may have also contributed to the problems, including rotating individuals as opposed to entire units on the front line. Now, behavioral scientists were effective in providing socio-cultural intelligence as part of the CORDS program, Civil Operations and Rural Development, which integrated military and development activities under one chain of command. However, there was also a problem there that, at least from standpoint of ethics, the course program was linked to the Phoenix program, which aimed at the neutralization of the electrons and their collaborators. Now, so far I have referred to the contributions of behavioral sciences in national security to military and intelligence. But the State Department during the Cold War, the diplomats also utilized selected psychiatrists in political advisory roles. And this roughly coincided with the era of the time, the easing of tensions with the Soviet Union. I want to mention here the work of two psychiatrists with the State Department, Dr. William Davidson. He also had a background in anthropology, and he served with the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency within the State Department. He was very active in the psychiatric community. He chaired a committee on psychiatry and foreign affairs at the American Psychiatric Association, and there he focused on fostering dialogue between Israeli and Palestinians. For the same purpose, he founded the Institute of Psychiatry and Foreign Affairs. And basically, Dr. Davidson had this vision of a role for psychiatry in what we call track 2 diplomacy, the unofficial contacts between citizens and groups that try to facilitate understanding and goodwill among countries. Another psychiatrist mentioned here, associated with the State Department, where he served in the medical unit, Dr. Steve Pichenik. He he became a high-level advisor on matters of crisis management, particularly hostage situations, which were an emerging problem as the threat of terrorism emerged in those years. And for this reason, he was consulted by the Italian government when the former Prime Minister Aldo Moro was kidnapped, eventually killed by the Red Brigades. So, moving fast here, but end of the Cold War, and say that long gone are those days, but there was a time in 1990s, early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when some thought that the ideological evolution of mankind had reached its peak and its end, and that we're beginning a peaceful post-historical phase where the Western liberal democratic paradigm had priority. Okay. Well, history went on. The nation deployed its military in a number of other circumstances, and I would say about this that in the past decades, reflecting the evolving standards of the time, there's been an increased attention to the care for the care of the people on active duty and the veterans exposed to combat-related stressor. Not without controversy, as in the case of the Gulf War syndrome, treatment of traumatic brain injuries, and the recognition of suicide as an emergency. Now, of course, more than national defense and intelligence and diplomacy is needed for the security and welfare of the nation. Many other threats exist to the domestic tranquility. And this will be a whole other conversation, but suffice to say that in the past, in the second half of the 20th century, behavioral scientists have played a number of roles and become an integral part of law enforcement and public safety in this country at various levels, developing a variety of fields like threat assessment, criminal profiling, consultation to interrogation, the employed assistance programs, and many others. behavioral scientists staffed the National Threat Assessment Center of the Secret Service and the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime of the FBI, where the behavioral analysis units are. With the war on terror, what we have is, in a way, to an extent, the blending of national defense and law enforcement. And a lot has been written down by behavioral scientists in this past 20 years to understand the psychological roots of political violence, to help assess and manage the threat of radicalization, and apply social-cultural understandings in order to win hearts and minds. I'll mention a few psychiatrists here. Dr. Mark Sageman is a forensic psychiatrist. He actually got his PhD before becoming an MD, and served as a CIA case officer in Pakistan in the 1980s. He studied global jihad and argued that radicalization should be seen as an individual process driven by personal relations of kinship and friendship. Domestic terrorism in the US has also been on the radar of behavioral scientists. The Department of Justice put together a panel to review the Ameritrax case. That was the 2001 anthrax attacks. And Dr. Greg Satoff and Dr. Ronald Shout, psychiatrists, were on this panel, co-authored the report. This is an extraordinary case of insider threat, a lone actor, and it became a psychological autopsy because the individual who would have been accused committed suicide. And Dr. Schouten is the director of the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, so third time here at St. Elizabeth's Hospital today. Also, I want to mention Dr. Reed Meloy, a forensic psychologist who recently developed Prep18. Prep18 is a structured professional judgment tool geared towards assessing and managing the threat posed by individuals who may engage in lone actor terrorism, and is utilized by counter-terrorism professionals. Now, priorities have shifted in the 2010s. The Department of Defense has with the 4+1 threat matrix. +1 is terrorism, and the 4s are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So great power competition has been back front and center in the international security landscape. And recently, Secretary of Defense Austin has outlined a vision of integrated, multi-domain deterrence. We have here the war in Ukraine, demonstrating that the rise in hybrid wars does not mean that brutal, old-fashioned conventional warfare is gone, and it also shows that the nuclear threat is real. Autocracies are challenging effectively democracies on a global scale, and the reality of the battlefield is physical, digital, and augmented. It's a battle for attention that goes on 24/7, is amplified by echo chambers created by social media platforms that are by design addictive. Cognitive neuroscience and related technologies that aim at cognitive and behavioral modifications allow dual use, like other biological sciences, can be weaponized, can have various applications. And some have proposed that experts in geopolitics should also be experts in understanding emotions like hope, fear, resentment, humiliation, and that we should all try to practice strategic empathy in a world that is more and more multipolar. The mind has been described as the sixth domain of operation, in addition to land, sea, air, and space and cyber. And the U.S. Special Operations Command, General Clark, has recently said that is prioritizing the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning driven sentiment analysis, which is the process of computationally identifying attitudes and opinions and craft messaging accordingly. And we shouldn't definitely not just focus on war and geopolitics. You know, we have a pandemic here, we have natural disasters all the time, we have the lack of domestic cohesion as a threat to domestic tranquility. So against all this backdrop, it is important to appreciate the importance of the human factor and the role of the behavioral sciences. For example, when it comes to all matters related to intelligence throughout the cycle of intelligence and counterintelligence. And I want to mention here the work of David Charney. Dr. Charney is an IWP alumnus who has presented here a number of times and has published on the psychology of the insider spy. And also the work of Ken De Cleva. Dr. De Cleva was my boss at the State Department. He was chief of psychiatry there, now he's in academia and at the Bush Foundation, think tank world. And he has further developed the field of psychopolitical profiling. Now, I have alluded to ethical issues, and I will say a few words about that because I think it's important. There are some facts here. The Hippocratic do no harm imperative, the prohibition against the direct or indirect participation in acts of torture by the American Psychological Association, the criticism of the Human Terrain Systems Project by the American Anthropological Association, the prohibition for psychiatrists to diagnose public figures. That's called the Goldwater Rule. It's known as the Goldwater Rule from Senator Barry Goldwater's name. Operational psychologists who do this work day to day in national security and law enforcement have thought about this hard and have come up with the standards for ethical practice. And you know, I put here the rogue warrior, Mr. Masinko, who founded SEAL Team 6. He recently passed away, and I'm thinking maybe he has a different view on this, and wonders why all this fuss anyway. He knows one thing or two about war and may have a different viewpoint, and that's also a valid viewpoint. So what here, where do we go from here? I'd say for a minute go back to the past, to the foundations. According to the Delphi Oracle, we should know ourselves and nothing should be too much. Aristotle taught us that virtue consists in finding an appropriate middle ground between extremes. But Machiavelli in The Prince told us that prophets without arms have not gone far in history. And there may be few exceptions, but generally it's a rule that applies. Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud had a public correspondence in the early 1930s. Einstein was an outspoken pacifist, and he asked Freud, why war? Warum Krieg? And Freud responded that conflicts of men are settled by the use of violence, and that there is not much use in trying to get rid of these violent instincts, but they can be diverted. So, just concluding here and saying that this kind of scratches the surface, but there is a pitch. You know, we could do more and develop even a course on behavioral sciences in national security. And these are some areas that we could work on. I just want to thank you so much for inviting me and for your attention today.
Any questions?
There are any questions that I can
Any
answer.
questions?
I'm particularly interested in the medical intelligence aspects, not just that we as Americans looking at that, but like say that Hezbollah or ISIS or any of the terrorist groups or extremist groups around the world, they seem to operate with, impunity, and they don't really care about the ethics of that. And I'm wondering if you've, have touched on that in any of your research, and what you think of that. The do no harm on one end, and then the let's do harm, on the other side. And in particularly with the Russians. I mean, did you see any, kind of attitude of any of these militaries using medical intelligence in medical warfare on purpose to harm and hurt?
Well, that's obviously not their view. They don't share the Hippocratic oath of do no harm. They do harm for the purpose of for political purposes and strategic purposes, and so there is definitely no Hippocratic oath what these organizations or and so I guess your point is how do we respond to that if we do no harm? Well, we let people who don't have the Hippocratic oath deal with that.
The Geneva Conventions, but many governments around the world don't pay any attention to that. That they don't value it, they don't practice it.
True.
I know how ethical it is. It's not, but are there? I don't know. Is there a way then to work with them to fix that and to not do that, to join the conventions and do no harm? How do they get away with it? I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I don't know if I have an answer to that, honestly, but it is very true. The reality of the international arena is harsh, and so these ethical issues. But still, these ethical issues are important for us because that's how we measure ourselves. Right? And professionally, these are things that matter.
I'm vaguely aware in the civilian world of psychology and so on that there's a big debate between classical techniques that are kind of related to philosophy, like talking care versus pharmacology, and that there's increasing attempts by people in the psychological world, or maybe I should call it the psychiatry world, to think of psychological issues as really like the biology of the brain and the biology of the physiology of emotion, physiology. And I just noticed that you haven't said anything about pharmacology in the context of behavioral sciences and national security, and I think there's like a whole world full of how do you get the warfighter to perform better, challenging conditions, pharmacologically.
Yeah, well, pharmacology really enters this world of national security in the Vietnam War. Psychopharmacology really starts in the 1950s, modern psychopharmacology. Wasn't ready for the Korean War. I did say a few things, I think, about cognitive, that's what I was alluding to, cognitive neuroscience and the related technologies. And yes, there is research ongoing, and there are applications for various, including psychopharmacological interventions for improving behavior and cognition in the context of national security. That's a dual use, right? But for example, the amphetamines were introduced many decades ago to help pilots they sustain attention for prolonged periods of time, right? They are now used for treating attention deficit hyperactivity disorder right now. So I didn't mention that, but that's very true. It's another area.
Enrico, this was a tremendous tour d'horizon of all of these issues, and I thank you so much for it. I wanted to ask you a little bit about any knowledge you have about the intersection of psychology and, let's say, moral strength and character and courage and things like this. What did it take? One of the great psychological challenges that we faced in the Cold War was to try to get atomized people in the Soviet Empire to feel connected once again, because they had been separated from one another by an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. So one had to make them feel as though they weren't alone. One had to help them somehow overcome the fear and petrification that came from this, overcome the sense of hopelessness, despair, and futile resignation of living under this type of a political order. And but then there is a moral aspect to this. When Pope John Paul II came to Poland, he basically appealed to people not to be afraid, but on a spiritual level. And so I'm, ultimately, this combination of moral strength and a psychological transformation took place that gave people the courage to take to the streets, not only in Poland, but in the Baltic states and eventually in various of the Soviet Union republics and in Moscow itself. And I'm wondering what your reflections are about this and what kind of literature you may be aware of, because you have an incredible array of literature that you've cited here that might address this nexus.
Well, I think that this goes to the work that was done, a lot of work that was done in those years on influence, how to influence behavior. And I'm sure that, I don't know the specifics, but I'm sure that some of that work also helped reach out to these people who were living under, in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet bloc, and support them, inform them, and help develop their opinions and then rise against this. But I think that your question speaks to that huge amount of work that was done in support of influence, influence operations.
There was a widespread use of applied social science research in the Vietnam War, most especially the Viet Cong Motivation and Morale Project, which obviously was unsuccessful in enabling an effective counterinsurgency. From your perspective, to what extent did the Iraq War era human terrain program repeat, learn from, or ignore the sort of difficult experience we had with the Viet Cong Motivation and Morale Project in the Vietnam War? Was there learning? Were there the same mistakes made? Did it go in a different direction?
I think that the jury is still out there. I think that there were, I don't know really the specifics, but I think that there were problems in the implement. There were a lot of good ideas, a lot of lessons to learn from, but then the implementation wasn't as good as one would want. Nonetheless, there was a lot of good work done there, and I think the idea was very, very good. The spirit was very good. And then there is the, of course, there are people who disagree fundamentally with that kind of work and the applications of anthropology and social sciences to social cultural intelligences and so forth, because then, they point in the direction of use of that intelligence for purposes that are, kinetic and so forth. More. But I do think that that's what they were looking at, the lessons learned from the court's experiences and what you are referring to.
You gave us a complete history of psychological approaches through U.S. history. I wonder what you think was the main victory through all these that you told us about.
The main victory. I don't know if it's a victory, but I really like the work that. I think it is a victory, but I don't know if it's the biggest victory. But I really like the work that Gerald Post and his team did in preparation of the Camp David negotiation. And really the intuition was that these two, based on their psychopolitical profiles, that these two leaders should not be dealing with each other directly. There should be somebody, really doing sort of the shuttle diplomacy within the same building, but not within the same compound, but not in the same room, because they were not made to understand each other and like each other. I think that's a fundamental contribution there. And then there's more, but that was an important event in history, right? And I also like the idea of Dr. Davidson of track 2 diplomacy and a place for the behavioral sciences in that.
You should be aware that Dr. Steve Pichernik is an IWP alumnus as well. Yeah, as a psychiatrist and State Department. You were telling us about him a little bit in the hostage situations. So he came and studied here.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting. I actually have met David Charming.
Yes.
I didn't know about Dr. Pichernik. Very interesting fellow.
Yes.
I read about him.
Thank you.
All right.